Good afternoon. I still claim I'm new here. I've been here 11 months now, so that's the reason perhaps I haven't met Pete before. It seems to me a little bit strange for someone like me to come and talk to you because I haven't got a technology to talk about, I haven't got a new fuel to talk about, and very much I'm trying to look at the problems that you've articulated so well, I think, during the day, from a different perspective. I look at it very much from the demand perspective rather than from the supply, which is where most of you have come from. And so when I think about the demand side and policy issues, it's really trying to add what I would call a dose of realism to some of the great ideas that we heard about today. And also to try and sort of put a context on to this desire for innovation and new ideas within this broader transport policy context. I want to look over the next, say, 10, 20 years and see what we have to offer. But I think one or two messages I want to leave with you. First, I think, is just the scale of the problem that we're together trying to address. And secondly, the time scale, and I'll come back to both of those later on, over which we're looking for change. So if I was to sort of give you the background, which most of you are fairly familiar with, is that there is a commitment, both within the UK and more widely within Europe, to meeting targets for greenhouse gas reductions, principally in the transport sector from CO2 emissions. And within that, the UK has a target of about 12.5% and also a self-imposed target of about 20%. But transport is this major user, about 25% of all UK energy, and producing about 27% of our greenhouse gas emissions. There are no transport-specific targets, and much of the policy debate in the UK is about whether there ought to be transport-related targets or not, or whether this is seen as a sector in which it is too difficult to make the sorts of contributions that other sectors are actually making. But again, as we said, it is almost wholly dependent upon oil at the moment, and much of that oil is imported, and there are issues relating to energy security. If we look at the sort of future in terms of where we're actually moving, this is the sort of best estimates that the government now comes up with over the short-term future to 2030. This is for UK emissions. It's in million tonnes of carbon. It's from 85 to 2030, and it doesn't really address some of the other issues related to international air emissions, which are in the bottom line there. But what we can say from this is that transport at present uses about 25% of energy and produces just over that figure in terms of greenhouse gases. By 2030, this figure will have gone up to 31%. And this is the sort of projections that are often used, and this is driven by the demand for people to travel. So this in turn is increasing both its relative contribution and its absolute contribution. And in that sense, it is the only sector that seems to be doing this. I want really just to focus on CO2 emissions. As we've heard, most of the other pollutants can be filtered out through add-on technologies, through better engine design, through various other issues. But still there are problems concerned about the cold start problem, the problems of low-level ozone and smog within cities. Although these have been reduced, transport is still a major contributor there. So the challenge that we have, I think, is this expected growth over the 20 or 30-year time horizon that I'm looking at. And this is primarily being driven, as I'll try and illustrate, by increases in travel distances. People are wanting to travel much further by a variety of different forms. So, and as the distances increase, particularly air transport, then the alternatives become much more problematic in terms of what we can actually do about it. But also, which hasn't really been mentioned today, we haven't really tackled maritime transport, which again is an enormous user of energy, and with the globalization of economies and outsourcing much of the production to cheaper countries or cheaper labour countries, we are now adding a very substantial transport component to the products that used to be produced much more locally. So both the air issue and the maritime issue is outside the Kyoto Agreement at the present time, although there is a debate within Europe to try and bring both of those, or at least air transport, into the emissions trading scheme, the EU ETS scheme. But even if the technological solution is available, then there are substantial problems, implementation problems, issues relating, as we've heard, to cost and time required to enable mass production. And it's trying to think about the mechanisms by which we can move from good ideas, which work well in a relatively limited and very specified environment, into one that can be used much more widely. The turnover of the car fleet is one issue. This is, in the UK, about 10 to 12 years is the typical turnover of the car fleet. It's shorter than in many other EU countries, where the car stock tends to be a little bit older than that. 20% of cars in this country are over 10 years old, and these are often the more polluting type vehicles. So one problem is, should policy be moving towards trying to speed up that process? Secondly, there are the higher initial costs of any new technology. We've heard a lot about that today. But the current sort of pricing with hybrids, 20 to 30% higher than conventional alternatives. What do we do about this? With mass production, the cost may come down. But at the present, we've got a problem which is saying the same vehicle you're having, or a similar vehicle, you're having to pay more. The supporting infrastructure. Again, this was an issue I wanted to raise as a very important one from the policy perspective, but it's also being raised from the technical perspective from many of the participants here. This needs to be in place for alternative fuels. In many countries now, I think in Sweden, where they have flexible fuel vehicles, about 10,000 of them, there are about 300 fuel stations, which is quite large. It's beginning to roll out. We've heard on the hydrogen refueling side, they're much more restricted. What are we going to do? How do the two infrastructures actually work together, the current established one and the new one? Would we be looking at a whole new range of fueling depots of a very different design to those that are actually in operation now? Does the dual system work? What are the transition costs? Fourthly, here we have the imbalance in the current purchasing patterns. In the UK, last year, in 2006, there were something of the order of 6,500 hybrids sold. For each hybrid that was sold, there were 25 SUVs that were sold, about 175,000. So we're talking about a very substantial scale problem, and whether that is really, certainly in the public knowledge, or whether it's in the knowledge of decision makers at all levels. And also that as we've heard again, that the voluntary agreements that have been in operation with to the market. And the fourth area, the final area, is the air transport, which again we've not talked about at all today. And international air travel is again about 20% of travel, averaging over 4,000 kilometres per person per year in this country. This is the fastest growing transport sector, both domestically and internationally. We have aircraft that have long lifespans. Many of the aircraft that are flying today will still be flying in 25, 30 years' time. There's a big debate at the present time about the size of the aircraft to try and reduce its energy consumption per unit, per passenger, and looking at alternative, more efficient, perhaps even slower engines and different sources of fuel. But again, this is growing at 6 to 7% per annum, a very substantial increase over this sort of 20 or 30 year period. In all of these four sectors, the load factors are critical. It's not just how far we're travelling, it's how many people are in the vehicle. It's far more efficient having a full car, bus or train or aeroplane than an empty one. Load matching, sharing can all have a substantial impact on efficiency. Can the vehicle be made adaptable to the use that's actually being made of it in a particular point in time? So can we shrink a vehicle? Can we grow a vehicle which would allow us the flexibility that we need in terms of the demands that are actually being made of it at any one point in time. No one's talked about that possibility in terms of the debate today. People have also said that, that the transport sector is one of the most expensive sectors to cut emissions in, because of low carbon technologies tend to be expensive in the transport sector, and the welfare costs of reducing demand for travel are high. And transport is also the sector that is experienced or is expected to be one of the fastest growing sectors in the economy. So again, we're not really we can't stand still to make progress. So where does this actually leave you? I wanted to leave you with 4 comments, which hopefully may be taken up in the discussion. The way I look at it on the demand side is much more pessimistic than you guys are actually looking at it in terms of the new technology. We have underestimated, I would say totally underestimated, the scale of the problem. The expected growth in travel to 2030 in this country is likely to be about 35%. And I don't know, but some of you may have some answers to this. I would challenge our technology people to suggest that even if we had a very high uptake of the technologies, would we actually make any contribution to a reduction in the current levels? Or can we, if we push very hard on technology, make that 35% down? The present sort of estimates are that we would have a 35% increase in travel, energy use will increase by about 23%. So that gap will be narrowing, but not totally eliminated. So can we look to reducing transport emissions or even to stabilising them over this period of time? The lead time required to switch to a low carbon future seems to need to be much longer than we've heard today, and perhaps we're led to believe. I can't see a switch from a carbon-dependent transport system to one that is carbon-free. It would take very much longer time than 30 years, even over a 40 or 50-year period, even if we just look at land-based transport rather than air transport. The involvement and responsibilities of all stakeholders is key to changing. At the present, many of the major stakeholders, particularly government, are rather lukewarm about many of the opportunities that they could be introducing to encourage greater, more rapid take-up of new technologies. For instance, mandatory emissions levels are being thought about, but there is a struggle to get those through the European Parliament and through the EU. The fuel duty escalator, which seemed to work in this country, was abandoned in 2000. National road pricing on environmental criteria is another option which is being debated, but there is intense resistance to that from many interest groups. So technology is important, technology is crucial, but there is also a necessity for behavioural change. And the only way I can see is actually looking to making transport a major contributor to carbon reductions is to travel less. And when we do travel, to travel by the most energy efficient form of transport in terms of what trips we're actually making, which comes back to the load factors. So I would say we've made a start, but we've got a long way to go. Thank you very much.